You know, when Amos was in the government, I had always wanted to hear him speak, and I'm so excited that he's here today to share a few comments. I read his statements on the internet, loved what he said, and this was somebody that I was desperately hoping at some point in his government career that he could speak at a Jamestown event. Uh, Sadly, it was not during when he was in government, but it's come out of government, and so I'm just really, we're the knowledge level of what Amos, and I think that the statements about his reputation in the State Department and the energy and vigor, which Dan Freed said that Amos gave, was really speaks to itself. So we're hoping that he will bring that same energy and vigor today in his presentation. Um, but you have his bio. He's the Senior Vice President of Telluride. He previously served as Special Envoy for International Energy Affairs, led State Department's Bureau of Energy Resources. He was our Chief Energy Diplomat. So you have the rest of the bio. I won't bore you with the details. We'll now move to Amos and his presentation. So Amos, come up here and share your views about Nord Stream 2. Thank you.
So I have nowhere to go but down from that introduction. So I don't know if to thank you or fault you for that introduction. I think I'm glad to be at the Jamestown Foundation. I really appreciate being invited, especially since I have no ability to deliver anything except for words these days. So I still appreciate the invitation and to be here. And I think one of the great things about coming to an event like this is looking around the room and seeing such a high percentage of people that I know, recognize, like, appreciate, respect, and admire. The downside is you look at a room that knows about the topic more than I do, and therefore it's always alarming to make sure that I'm on topic here. But also following, I got to listen to part of the panel before, and first of all, it's a coup to have that kind of a panel all assembled together. That is some of the brightest minds that we had in the last administration, and I think some of the brightest minds on these topics in Washington writ large. Nord Stream 2 is, in my mind, one of the most important projects that has been designed. And I'm going to talk about Nord Stream 2 in a broader context of Nord Stream 2 plus Turk Stream, because I think that they are twin projects, and I think that a myopic view of only one of the projects sins to the broader context of what they're actually about. So we can get it out of the way. What they're not about is economics. So therefore, now you can start having the conversation about, is this why are they interconnected, Nord Stream and Turk Stream, and what are they trying to achieve? I want to use the title of the topic that I was asked to discuss as I walk away from it, because the title is Nord Stream Project's Implications for U.S. LNG Exports to Europe. And I think this is the trap of how we talk about Nord Stream 2 and how we talk about this topic writ large. I don't want to repeat what the previous panel talked about, and that is, we all understand that Russia uses energy as a leverage, both economic and political, and it is doing that for a number of reasons. One is to achieve political influence in the countries that are affected, and the other is to achieve a continued separation and degradation of the unity of Europe, to the degree that there is one. When it comes to energy, there is really no such thing as energy union. That's why the term was created. You don't create terms to describe things that already exist, but things that you aspire to. Energy union doesn't exist for a very basic reason. The infrastructure legacy of the Cold War. You had a centralized system that Russia provided energy, both electricity and gas and oil and other liquid products, but they came from Russia. The RAW-UES intersection with Europe was on the grid side, and there was a lot of work in the 1990s, late 1990s, and Ambassador Bryce's time working on it was separating the RAW-UES system from Eastern Europe, and in some cases very successfully. And in the gas side that we're talking about today, the pipelines that obviously go through Ukraine into Europe are the ones that are that legacy. So you don't really have a European energy issue because there's no such thing as European energy. There is the eastern part that has the legacy infrastructure and by and large has few, if any, options away from those infrastructure projects and infrastructure installed. And you have the other side of Europe that has a diversified energy portfolio because it never had these massive state-owned infrastructure that interconnected them to Russia. What we always wanted to achieve was to equalize, to create an energy union, to make Eastern Europe as diversified, or not as, but diversified in a similar way to the way that Western Europe was. This project intends to do has the same goal, to equalize, but in the opposite direction, to create infrastructure that is a new legacy infrastructure that costs multiple billions of dollars. And once you invest in infrastructure, all other projects, even if they're economic, fall away because I've invested $10 billion in this infrastructure. And these are not small. This is 110 BCM if you count both of them together, right? So this is an enormous amount of gas that is there. Now let's look at the economics of it. If I came to my board of directors and I said, I have an idea for investment that I need approval for, and you have to assume that any board of directors, an investment of $9.5 billion probably would have to go to the board. And the board would say, and you'd say to the board, look, we need to get gas to Germany in order to be able to distribute it throughout Europe. And my only problem is that I already have a pipeline that already achieves that goal. The first question from the board is, what the hell are you talking about? I'm not going to build a new pipeline system if I already have one. The last thing any company ever wants to do, and I work for one, is to build infrastructure that is not necessary. That's the one thing you try not to avoid. So the economics are not there because the Ukraine pipelines are already serving. And therefore, the idea of creating this pipeline is to equalize that, to achieve what I had in Eastern Europe, in Western Europe as well, with a massive legacy project that will last me for a number of generations into the future, lock in new contracts. And if you want to start look at the experimentation, we used to have this argument when I was in the government, well, how can you really be so certain that if it's built, the Ukraine pipelines will be depleted? And I said, I do two fundamental things. One, I look at facts. And second, I take people at their word, whether there are allegations to the contrary. When a CEO of a company says, I'm going to stop using a pipeline in 2019, I believe it. I don't have a reason not to believe it, especially since the only reason not to believe it is the commentary on it being given by others. Well, it's not really true. You need both. But he said he's going to shut it down. When we went to talk to the Turkish government about why you're doing TurkStream, they said, well, I have no choice, Amos. I get everything you're saying. I'm on your side. However, if he shuts down the pipeline through Ukraine that reaches Turkey, if you're wrong and he's not bluffing and he does it, what are you going to tell the people in Istanbul when it's cold? I have to have an alternative. So both sides here, the reasons these projects work is because people take them at their word. So I take them at their word. The second thing is a fact. The EU decided through a series of negotiations to reach a settlement agreement with Gazprom and allow the Opal pipeline, which is not on the map, I think, to go up to 100% capacity. If you look at, yeah, right there. So once Opal lost the restriction and Gazprom could fill it and use it, you had to look at, okay, where did that gas come away from? Because demand did not suddenly increase magically overnight. Demand is relatively flat. So it has to be a redistribution. The molecules almost one-to-one came out of the Ukraine pipeline. So the transit routes became evident of this is a one-to-one replacement. So the goal here was multiple, and that's the beauty of this project. If I'm Russian, I think this is a good project. It makes a lot of sense. I don't have to worry about the economic consequences because I'm a majority, I'm a publicly traded, but majority state-owned. So I have my access to low-cost capital, right? And low cost, I'm using euphemistically. I have zero-cost capital. And on the other hand, I have been able to get 5 companies to finance the other half. So it doesn't really cost me all that much. So I'm good with that. And it gives me an extra multi-decade deal in Europe. Second, I've been battling Ukraine for the last several years. And what I've not been able to achieve on the battlefield, I may be able to achieve in other ways. If I can shut down all of the Ukraine transit, and I can take somewhere in the just below $2 billion a year of revenues from Ukraine, a country that needs an IMF program, needs European cash interventions and support, American billion-dollar loan guarantee, this is $2 billion per year, then I probably will achieve something here. I can then come in and save Ukraine later through a mechanism of my choosing, through a government of my choosing, and have an easier time. And I'll achieve economically what I was not able to achieve on the battlefield. Third, I get to use energy again as a lever, not only relevant to Ukraine, but relevant to, I don't like a lot of decisions that were reached at the FAC, at the Foreign Affairs Council, in the EU, at the country leaders level. Even though the press talk a lot about certain Eastern European leaders that have been closer to Russia, at the same time, they voted for sanctions, they supported the US position on the Minsk process, and even as political changes happened in the US, there was no change to that. These sanctions are still in place. But if I can re-extend my lever and start working it in a more effective manner and start getting engaged a little bit more, I can return to the day where I can utilize that more effectively. And that's why these work. The next piece of why this is great is because I learned my lesson if I'm Gazprom. I kind of didn't pay attention to that silly little LNG facility FSRU project that Lithuania did. Now, the George W. Bush administration in its last month in office gave $1 million, or just shy of $1 million, for the feasibility study for that project. And later on, the Obama administration supported it as much as we could. But it's a small little FSRU. What does it make a difference? Because it was the first realization of what happens on the ground when diversification comes. Here's a small little island area. Right? We used to refer to the Baltic states as an energy island. And here comes an FSRU that, guys, look at the data, the public data. It doesn't import all that much LNG. It's a few cargoes a year. But just the announcement of the contracts being signed to build the ship in Korea for delivery achieved the unbelievable. That little Lithuania was able to achieve a renegotiation of a contract with Gazprom that brought about savings that paid triple the 3x of the cost of the terminal. So now you have a threat. And the threat is, if suddenly you get more LNG terminals in Europe, we're going to have to compete on price and potentially join what the rest of the world is going to face, which is no more long-term contracts. And if you put the problem that, Europe likes, statistics are always evil, but you can manipulate them any way you want. So people say, well, Europe has a lot of LNG terminals. They're just underutilized. You don't need more. Yes, because they're all in the wrong places. You have a whole bunch of LNG terminals in Spain and Portugal. But guess what? France doesn't allow any gas to go from Spain into France or into the rest of Europe that way, so it's stranded. And even with that, we're seeing a 25% increase year on year this year in Spain. But that's stranded. But how do you get to Bulgaria with LNG? How do you get to Hungary with LNG? or to Croatia, or to Serbia, or to Romania that has the least exposure. You can't. It's impossible. That's what has to change. And the threat was, here was coming a change in the LNG market. The American economy is transforming and revolutionizing energy. We went from the importer, one of the best importers, to we're going to be the largest or second largest exporter by 2020, 2021. And by 2023, we'll be completely number one as wave 2 gets commissioned. So Europe will be able to take advantage of it, except if these projects get built. If you have a Turk Stream project that doesn't only supply Turkey just a simple transition from moving the supplies from the Ukraine pipeline to Turk Stream, but you build a second pipe that brings in 15 BCM of gas into Greece, and from Greece into Bulgaria and et cetera, well, who's going to build an LNG? Which company is going to put capital behind an LNG terminal there? Or in Croatia, if Nord Stream 2 happens. So now you have that fourth element of why these projects make a lot of sense. If you're Gazprom, you're defending market share. It's not only politics. The economics piece is there. It's just it's monopolistic. It's defense of a monopoly status and to dissuade other companies from doing it. Now, I want to go back to one of the things I said at the beginning, and that's the title of today's, what I was supposed to talk about, and the title of what I've not talked about, and explain why. This title is a big trap that we have to be aware of. I'll read it again. Nord Stream project's implications for U.S. LNG exports to Europe. I will say now, Nord Stream 2 has no implications for U.S. LNG. And it's important that we state that, because there is a confusion that some try to equate the U.S. position on Nord Stream to the Russian position. Russia wants to dominate you, Europe, and the Americans want to dominate you. They're just using LNG. They're trying to go after Nord Stream 2 to bring in American LNG. Now, I said this till I was blue in the face when I was in my previous job. I don't care what LNG comes into Europe. Most likely, it won't be U.S. LNG. Just from a pricing and market perspective. The only contracts that have been signed by the Polish LNG terminal thus far are Qatari. And that's fine. If you do a Greece one, maybe it'll be American, maybe it won't be competition. If you look at who's potentially going to build the Croatian terminal, it's not an American company, it's European companies. So I don't really care as a U.S. government whose LNG it is. I just want it to be there. From an LNG company, from a U.S. LNG company, I want to sell LNG. That's me as to learn. I want to sell LNG. I'll sell it at market prices. And I don't care where that market is. And I have a growing market in China, and I have a growing market in Japan, and I have a growing market in Korea. I have Bangladesh going from 0 to 17 million tons. Europe's an important market. But whether it's me or it's somebody else, it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. Now, part of the challenge for LNG, for American companies to sell LNG into Europe, is that we know the Russian price. It's a well-known price. It's 5 cents less than mine, or 2 cents, or 5 cents, or whatever. But that's what the price is. If Europe wants to have LNG from a diversified source, it'll have to be willing to pay a market price. Not a premium, but a market price. If it wants to always, but it's difficult, because as a government, I want to come out and say, I need American gas, or I need LNG, and I want it to be in the market. But then I look at the market price, and I look at what I can get from extending my pipeline gas contract. It's a little cheaper. So now I have a state-owned company that says, wait a minute, my mandate is to get the best deal possible. My government's mandate is to affect the geopolitics. That's why there's no deal signed. So again, I come back to this. U.S. LNG, this is not about opposing Nord Stream 2, is about U.S. geostrategic interests in Europe. And in my opinion, it should be a European interest, not a U.S. interest. And if Europe wants to support its companies and its countries, its member states, then there has to be more of the good steps that have been taken, like 100 million euros for the Croatia LNG project. Do the same for Greece. Put in place the infrastructure that the private sector won't pay for, and let the private sector pay for the infrastructure that they will. The private sector will not pay for a reverse flow pipeline between Croatia and Hungary. The EU can. The private sector will pay for an FSRU. So even when they give the money, I think there has to be re-examination with a private sector mindset to make these projects happen. Don't pay for the FSRU. Trust me, the private sector will do it. If there is a pipeline that goes from Croatia at full reverse flow capacity all the way to Hungary, there'll be companies paying for that FSRU. Same is true between Greece and Bulgaria, and from Bulgaria to Serbia. You do the onshore infrastructure, the private sector will do the rest and figure out how to finance it. It's not expensive. But there's a race here. What happens first? These terminals or these pipelines? These pipelines are expensive, but doable. Now I'm encouraged, I'll end on a very positive note. I want to, something that my former colleague Ben Schmidt mentioned before, and Mike Carpenter. We have not seen as much good news on Nord Stream 2 and positive movement in a long time. And when we presented and had the conversation with the Swedes in order to explain what these island would do, I think that was an important moment. And I looked at the fact sheets being given out, and I'll do one deviation from the fact sheet. Denmark and Sweden are not the same. Sweden has a EEZ, and in Denmark it goes through the territorial waters. From a legal perspective, that is different. They're not both in the EEZ. Denmark can do things, and that's why they're considering legal changes to be able to do that, that Sweden cannot do under international law, under EU rules, et cetera. But I think that we're at a moment now with the EU statements on the third energy package implications for offshore, for the whole pipeline. The German election, I think, clearly changed the political dynamic, and the statements from Chancellor Merkel are, if you are someone who follows the nuances of words that are being used in statements, that you can see there's a very important shift in some of the words that she has chosen to use on this project. Not just commercial, but the word political suddenly appears. Certain party that is directly, its chairman is directly related to the project, is no longer going to be in government. So I think that the messages are there. But at the end of the day, it's going to have to be Europe that makes a decision. Do we want this project for our energy security? Is this good not just for energy security, but for our national security? And are we willing to live with the consequences of a deep economic crisis in Ukraine? And I think the answer to that is clear. That is bad for Ukraine, it's bad for Europe, it's bad for the United States, and therefore the policy has to continue as it was and be strengthened and use the momentum that exists that has been generated over the last several weeks and last couple of months. I'll stop there, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
So obviously, when it comes to the markets and the private sector, I'm as layman as it gets. My background is in strategy, so quantitative analysis is really not my forte. So I'm just curious if you can give me some sort of illustration. What are the costs, and even just a ballpark figure would be greatly appreciated, to create an LNG terminal?
An LNG, a receiving terminal?
Yes.
So there's no single answer for that question, obviously. And that's probably about 50-50, 50% a cop-out answer of mine and 50% true. Are you going to build an onshore LNG terminal the way we had in the United States? That is a physical structure that's built onshore. That's very expensive. But as the technology changed, you can now have what's called an FSRU, which is a floating storage and regasification unit. And essentially, it's a boat that you can dock at the boat, and you can offload the LNG as a liquid. The ship regasifies it, and then you put it into a pipeline that connects you to the onshore. That is relatively cheap. It can, again, what does it cost? It can cost a few $100 million. depending on you're doing a new ship, an old ship. You can lease it today. It's just like me asking you about a car. What do you have in the car? Are you going to lease it? Is it a 3-year lease? Is it, there are a lot of ways to do it. Companies have, depending who is commissioning it, is it the government or is it the private sector company? What's their balance sheet look like? What's their cost of capital? Can they finance it? They can. And that's why it gets very cheap, because at the end of the day, you just finance it. And if it's done in a way that is through commercial lens versus through a government lens, then you do it when you already have first contracts to deliver the gas and sell it. And based on the contracts that you have for the offtake of gas, you can finance, the bank will then finance it for you based on the revenue that you're going to have. So you can amortize it fairly easily. So it's, for the governments, this would be more expensive than it would be for the private sector to do.
Thank you, Amos, for the presentation. My name is Alena Smolovskaya. I'm representing Naftogaz here at this event. I would like to make a comment on, when I look at this map of Europe, it looks to me very much like a chart when you explain to your students the prisoner's dilemma, because we have this issue of trust in the European gas market. When you know that if you cooperate, if two parties cooperate, their general outcome will be positive for both of them. But if you know that your counterparty may deviate and fix a deal outside of your agreement, then you will be much worse off. What we see in the European continent, that there are too many of such things when people would have benefited if they played together in the common interest, like with the energy union and with many other things, but they seem not to lack trust in each other in these agreements. And that what makes the Russian advance in the European Union so productive. So we see these results. I would like to say that the consequences of that is that Russia is very easily using the disinformation tools, all of its common weapons, which they are so skilled in using, like saying that Ukrainian system is obsolete, it's not reliable, and we need to do something to replace it with the Nord Stream 2. And this argument is falling on a very fertile soil because people do not trust and they are looking for excuses to make a deal with the Russians. I would like to say that Ukraine has been a very reliable partner to the European Union in very challenging conditions in the past 3 years. This year we have transited 80 billion cubic meters of Russian gas to Europe, which we. Yes, I would like to raise the issue is that if we want to beat Nord Stream, if we want to build a joint market in the European Union, we have to do something with the issue of trust. And in Ukraine, you have a player whose position is fixed. We cannot deviate because we do not have this option to make a deal with Russia. So we could start building this trust in the European continent, starting from Ukrainian gas market. That was basically question, not question, but a piece to the puzzle.
Well, look, I think Naftogaz has done a tremendous job over the last few years in first cleaning house a little bit from the legacy challenges that it faced from the past. But second, most importantly, Naftogaz is no longer a Russian market for gas. Naftogaz buys its gas from the West, and it is increasing its production, and it has increased efficiency of use. So I think the dynamic that existed a few years ago, the lever over Ukraine is no longer, is Ukraine going to freeze in the winter, but rather will it be frozen out of its revenues? And that's a credit to Ukraine, and to Naftogaz. But I think Lona's right. We have to increase the trust in the process and in Ukraine's abilities, and that they're not, and its intentions, so that they don't fall prey to the disinformation campaign.
Royal Atlantic Council. I wanted to suggest that the title for this speech should be not Nord Stream project's implications for US LNG exports to Europe, but that the Nord Stream is a threat to the European single market in gas. And the argument, surely, I would put you is this, is that the real case, the real argument that the US LNG can make to the Europeans is how can you have Nord Stream 2 and how can you have a single market in gas? And surely, if you want what you say you want, which is an open, functioning, dynamic market, how can you have Nord Stream 2? And it seems to me it is the single market argument which cuts so deeply and so powerfully against Nord Stream 2, and where the US can work both in the public and private sectors very strongly with a significant number of member states and with a large number of private companies in Europe.
I think I said as much in my comments that that's where I think the title is in reality.
Thank you for a great talk, and I really enjoyed your presentation. My question is actually on the demand side. We on this map we also see a lot of pipelines going into Europe. Lately, because of the economic crisis, there have been discussion that demand for natural gas is stagnant in Europe, and there's not enough, demand for that. How is the perspective in this regard, and for LNG supplies and also pipeline gas?
Well, I think that first you have a declining European production base because of the pretty drastic reduction in the Netherlands production there of gas. So you do have, it's not about a demand increase, but there's a shortage of what used to be the supply. So there's going to have to be balance out there. Second, by and large, the projections over the last several years have been for a fairly flat gas demand in Europe. However, you're now seeing some challenges to that based on member state decisions on their own energy mix. So when you start making announcements about phasing out nuclear, and now so the first reaction to that was, okay, I'm growing my renewables by fiat, right? And I'm phasing out nuclear. So what happens in order to substitute the high cost for my balance sheet is to phase out gas in favor of coal. But which is what happened in Germany to a large extent. But when you then announce, as we just heard around just ahead of the COP, member states starting to make announcements about phasing out coal and not building new coal power plants. And again, this is not a European, but specific individual member states. If you're going to get rid of coal and you're going to get rid of nuclear, then if that actually happens, I think you're going to start seeing new models coming out on projections where gas may see some increase because you're going to have to use something for power generation if you're going to get rid of two major sources. Now, it's not uniform, and you can have one country phasing out nuclear, but its grid is interconnected with its neighbor who did not phase out nuclear, so in fact, their citizens are still using nuclear, but it's just not their own. But so you're going to have some of this, you have to see how that all balances out. But I think you have a chance of some growth in the gas market. But what's important is that the gas market writ large is growing. If you just look at the statements out of India, if you look at the statements out of China, Prime Minister Modi recently talked about transitioning to a gas-based economy. President Xi's 5-year plan has a modest 4 to 5% increase in gas. But if you put that in the Chinese context and translate that into million tons, that's an enormous amount of gas. The new government in South Korea just announced that they're phasing out nuclear and coal. And you're talking about a 40% increase potentially in what is already the second largest gas purchaser in the world. So you're starting to see where this is happening, and it's coming from other sources as well. I mean, I'm pretty bullish on what's going to happen in the Gulf as you transition from fuel oil to gas. What will happen, what we're seeing happening in Bangladesh and Pakistan, these are major increases in gas. So starting in the next decade, 2020, 2021, if you count the demand increases that I just mentioned, and you look at what pipelines are being built and what liquefaction plants are being built, we're already short come 2025.
Hi, Gugaratz with Argus Media. Amos, you just made a great case for dispelling this trap behind the premise of the title, but it's an appealing notion, right? I mean, I think we
It's
heard
an appealing, sorry?
it's an appealing notion, and we heard President Trump talk about it in Poland. So, as an LNG exporter, does it help to have a big mouth champion of LNG exports in a government? Does it help you? Not necessarily in Europe, but around the globe.
So first, far be it from me to speak for the president, the current president of the United States. I don't have that position. I think it's more effective to talk about the importance of U.S. LNG as diversifying the global market and liquefying the global market, making it a more dynamic, more liquid market. Is being traded. And I mentioned something before that I can expand based on this question, which is the concept of contracts are going to change dramatically. We have lived for decades with 15, 20-year contracts for gas. We've lived with destination clauses that restrict the purchaser from how they can sell it. We have lived for decades with take or pay contracts that put you in great debt. If you look at the Hungarian and some other cases where a bunch of warm winters and you're suddenly stuck with a lot of volume that you have to pay for that you didn't need. All these are going away. Now, the EU was ahead of its time, and in the third energy package, I've always applauded the EU for being really smart with the third energy package. It was a great package of regulations. And one of the most important regulations was getting rid of destination clauses, for instance. Without that, in June 2014, we would not have been able to reverse flow into Ukraine. But as we go into this dynamic, what's enabling this new reality that we're going towards of shorter and shorter term contracts and more flexibility and a global market which commoditizes natural gas away from linking it with oil could not have happened without the United States global shale gas boom followed by an LNG boom. So I wouldn't come in and say to Europe, look, American LNG is coming to Europe and it'll save you. It's not. We'll sell it if it's commercial on economic terms, and I think it can be, and I think it is very competitive, but it's going to be a commercial issue. I think the power of the American LNG story is what it's done to the global gas market, and I think that has positive climate implications, trade implications, and global diversification, and less and more energy security writ large, including for Europe.
Hello. Germany says that the Nord Stream 2 package, it's a purely business project. What kind of competence would the EU have to step in under the third energy package to block that, if anything? And furthermore, what could the US do to support that effort?
I think if you are a company that's invested in the project, it is absolutely a commercial project. And look, I don't say that just as a joke. There is a difference between a government perspective and a private sector perspective. A company makes a decision to invest based on a broad set of parameters of whether or not this is good for my bottom line in the short, medium, or long term. That's the job of a company. That's the fiduciary responsibility towards its shareholders. A government has to come and say, does this fit and support my ultimate national security goals? I think the weakness in the European system right now is a legacy one, and that is that energy is not something where the central Brussels has great powers to make a decision. There are those who say that's a good thing, and I can understand that. You probably would have, if the European Parliament had to do it, you'd probably ban fracking across and ban nuclear across and ban coal across. And the consequences would be very high power prices across the continent. But it also leads to a challenge of when you're looking at telecom, it's about telecom. When you're looking, and you have privacy issues and so on that you can deal with. When you're looking at energy, there are these two dimensions that we're talking about today. There's the sector as a commodity, electricity, energy mix, fuels, heat, et cetera. And there is the geostrategic. And they were not dealt with in the original regulation in together, in conjunction with each other. Governments have to have the ability to say, I understand the commercial implications, and even if they're good, this is not good for me from a national security perspective. And when you ask what, to your specific second part of the question, what can the EU do about it? I think they can do exactly what they're talking about doing right now. They're on the right path. They're talking about saying that the third energy package should apply. And you can't be a bundled entity into it. You're going to have to separate. And if I do that, it's going to change the nature of this project. And I think by starting to do both of those things, putting the regulatory environment in place to these massive projects, but also understand if you don't put in place the ability to use national security as a consideration and only rely on commercial implications, then you're opening yourself up to great risk. And I think that's something that has to be taken into account. And I'll leave you with this, without naming any countries and any names. So many of my meetings in my last job with senior government officials say, look, we agree with you, but when we open this door, we don't. In this room, I can tell you this, of course, this is a political project. Of course, this has implications on Ukraine. Of course, this is opening ourselves up. But what are we going to do? I don't know what to do about it. That was the consensus across the board. Countries that you would not be surprised and countries that you may be surprised. But it was a consensus. And I think that there is an opportunity at this moment, and I think this conference is coming at a very, very opportune time, that we can take advantage of the current state of affairs to focus on it more and to bring about a change and shift, not only as it relates to Nord Stream 2, but as it relates to the future and how Europe includes the national security dimension into decision-making of economic nature.
For coming here and for answering all your questions and presenting a perspective that is very important. I particularly appreciate his point about not countering one project, one political project with another potentially political project. LNG is a commercial project, LNG export, while Russian pipelines could be very political, not only commercial. Thank you very much, Amos.